Francesca Pentassuglio, Socrates on Eros and Virtue, a Comparative Reappraisal.
Thanks for this kind introduction. I would like to thank Donald Morrison for inviting me, as well as for organizing this important series of meetings for more than 2 years now. So this presentation is part of a book project devoted to Socratic Eros. The volume that should hopefully appear next spring aims to provide a comprehensive study of Socratic erotics, also through a comparison with previous conceptions and earlier philosophical accounts on the subject. Today, I'm going to focus on a specific aspect, namely the relationship between Eros and aretē, which provides a common ground for the writings of almost all the so-called first generation Socratics, while maintaining as much as possible the comparative perspective underlying the book's project and mentioned in the title of the talk. In what follows, I will mostly deal with Aeschines and Xenophon's accounts and make only a few final references to Plato, whose theory of Eros has received a vast amount of scholarly attention. This is not only for reasons of time, but also because authors explicitly ascribed certain views on Eros and virtue to Socrates, whereas Antisthenes, for example, would require a different approach, which implies the use of Xenophon's symposium as a source, and which is not feasible here. But I will be happy to address Antisthenes' account or to say more about Plato during the discussion. So I will start by discussing some passages from Xenophon's Memorabilia and Symposium, and then dwell on Aeschines, Alcibiades, and Aspasia to conclude with some remarks on Plato's Symposium. As you can see, I'm not going to follow a chronological criterion in presenting the sources. Rather, I will seek to trace a path of progressive integration of Eros into elenchus, in short. By way of introduction and to attempt an initial organization of the material, we could distinguish 3 main aspects of the multifaceted relationship between Socrates and Eros portrayed across the various Socratic dialogues. First, the figure of Socrates erotikos, so someone who behaves erotically and is always in love, or more explicitly, the figure of Socrates erastes. Second, Socrates as an object of Eros, and third, Socrates as an expert on Eros. These 3 facets are clearly interconnected and cannot actually be separated, but they provide a general backdrop to frame the more specific Eros aretē nexus. So let's start with Xenophon. The first difficulty one encounters in an investigation of the Eros-virtue relationship in Xenophon is that of reconciling 2 seemingly conflicting views, if not on Eros, on erotic matters. On the one hand, we have the figure of a Socrates who is not only encrates as regards sexual pleasures, but who exhorts his companions to enkrateia in this sphere, among others, warning them of the dangers that can arise both in public and private life from a lack of self-mastery in erotic behaviors. On the other hand, we have a positive conception of Eros and its effects, also with regard to virtue, both in the Memorabilia and especially in the Symposium, a fundamentally positive view that emerges on several occasions in the portrayal of the Socratic art of mastropeia, which, however, I will leave aside, in the speech Socrates delivers in chapter 8, and finally in the depiction of the virtuous philia between Callias and Autolycus. Now, in order to untangle this apparent contradiction, it is useful to delve into the relationship between Eros and other cognates or related notions. In the first place, between Eros and Aphrodisia, and Eros and epithumia. The first point has often been addressed by scholars, not least because it recalls the fundamental notion of enkrateia. At the very beginning of the Memorabilia, in commenting on the accusation against Socrates of corrupting the young, Xenophon presents Socrates as the most self-controlled of all men regarding aphrodisia, as well as other types of appetite. It is text 1 on the handout, which shall be in the chat. So this trait is repeatedly emphasized by Xenophon, and many other passages could be mentioned. In 1:314, for instance, Xenophon highlights Socrates' greater ability to stay away from beautiful young men. Self-mastery over aphrodisia was not, however, only a virtue of Socrates himself, but also something Socrates educated his companions to. The following passage, text 2, is an example of Socrates' advice in this field. When he found that Critias was in love, Eronta, with Euthydemus in the way, I quote, of those who enjoy carnal lust, prostaphrodisiaton somaton, he tried to restrain him from it. The dangers of indulging in aphrodisia are immediately made clear. It engenders servile behavior unworthy of a kalogagatos. The detrimental effects of a lack of self-control in sexual pleasures affect various fields such as friendship and leadership. In 151, for example, Socrates warns against the lack of ankrateiai regarding aphrodisia for those appointed as generals. Now, it is interesting to note that some of these passages show a certain overlap between aphrodisia and lagneia, so lasciviousness or sexual indulgence, which are often used interchangeably. This is the case with the first section of Book 2, extracts of which are given in the handout as text 3. At the very beginning of the chapter, Xenophon states that he's going to report some conversations demonstrating that Socrates exhorted his companions, I quote, to practice self-control, askainin krateian, as regards eating and drinking, sexual indulgence, sleeping, and endurance of cold and heat and toil. The list is very similar to that provided in 121, but the term used here is lagneia instead of aphrodisia. Later in the same passage, within the conversation with Aristippus, Socrates first questions his interlocutor about the power to control sexual passions, here to aphrodison in krateiai, and then gives the example of some animals, lagneia, again alternating the two terms. More importantly, these negative consequences also seem to be ascribed to Eros. So in 1:22, which is text 4 on the handout, it is said, I quote again, that those who get involved in love affairs as erotas lose the power of caring about right conduct and avoiding wrong, becoming unable, for example, to manage money. So the picture outlined so far seems to rule out any positive role of Eros in the acquisition of virtue, and even to put it in contradiction with aretē. The first point to make, however, is that Socrates' exhortation to exercise self-mastery always concerns aphrodisia and not Eros itself. And with the sole exception of the last passage mentioned, the negative effects pointed out by Socrates derive from indulging in aphrodisia, which for this reason sometimes seems indistinguishable from lagneia. The distinction between the two concepts is shown, so Eros and aphrodisia, is shown, for example, by a passage in the Hero, where Hero says to Simonides that tamitero tos aphrodisia are more satisfying, into 1:29. Moreover, a closer examination of other passages reveals a much more complex and nuanced situation. Aphrodisia themselves are not unconditionally negative. Socrates' argument in 4:112, which is text 5, suggests a positive view of aphrodisia when one moves from the level of individuals to that of the species. In this case, the fact that human beings are provided continuously with don aphrodisian hedonai, and not only in a fixed season like animals, stems from the special care of providential gods towards humankind. But more elements for analysis can be gained from a closer examination of the relationship between Eros and epithumia. A good starting point is provided by Memorabilia 459, corresponding to text 6. Socrates here contrasts encrateia with acrasia, and from this opposition, he draws the conclusion that only encrateia leads to true enjoyment of pleasures. The text is explicit about this. I read, though pleasure is the one and only goal to which incontinence, acrasia, is thought to lead men, she herself cannot bring them to it, whereas nothing produces pleasure so surely as self-control, head encrateia. A key role is played here by epithumia. Only the desire to eat, drink, sleep, and aphrodisiazo makes it possible to truly enjoy the ensuing pleasures, and this epithumia can only be engendered by a previous exercise of self-mastery. Hence the conclusion, only encrateia, I quote again, causes them to experience any pleasure worth mentioning in such enjoyments. Now, this has important consequences for the Xenophontic theory of pleasures, but aretē is not specifically at issue here. In order to proceed with the argument, it is useful to dwell briefly on the use of the word epithumia, which turns out to be comparable to Eros in many respects. There is no shortage of passages presenting epithumiae in a negative light. In 125, Xenophon claims that Socrates did not encourage love of money in his associates and drew them away from other desires. And in 124, he reports that Alcibiades and Critias were able to control their base desires with the help of Socrates, as long as they were with him. Epithumiae are here qualified as base, as mechalai, a first indication that desire itself is neither good nor bad. This is particularly clear from another passage, which is text 7, where epithumia and epithumein take on both a positive and a negative connotation in the same context. In defense of Socrates, Xenophon says that he turned his companions away from evil desires, poneras epithumias, and exhorting them to desire the fairest and noblest virtus, tekalistes, aretes epithumein. Epithumia is in itself, so to speak, morally neutral and is determined in one sense or another by its object, as several other passages confirm. For example, Socrates warns Glaucon of the dangers of his desire for ambition to eudoxein epithumon in 3:16, but in 1:21 he refers to the experiences that prompted the soul to desire self-control, tes sophrosiones epithumei. More importantly, Socrates himself is said to arouse desire for virtue in those who associate with him. A key passage is Memorabilia 1:2-3, which is text 8, which features an important description of Socratic education and how it works, again in response to the accusation of corrupting the young. In this context, Xenophon refers to the desire for virtue, aretes epithumein, instilled by Socrates, which is paired with the idea of imitation or emulation, eutomimeomai. As Socrates possesses those virtues that would make his associates kalokia gatoi, it is chiefly by imitating him that they start pursuing the kind of moral improvement which represents the goal of Socratic education. So Socrates improves his disciples by engendering a desire for virtue, which goes along with an impulse to imitate him. Therefore, far from being unconditionally negative, epithumia can have aretē as its object, and as such be placed at the heart of Socratic education. One may also recall in this regard Memorabilia 4:8-11, where it is said that those who desire virtue, so oi aretes ephiemenoi, mourn the loss of Socrates. The next point crucial to our discussion concerns the relationship between epithumia and Eros, a relationship so close that in Memorabilia 397, which is text 9, Eros is defined as its strong desire, then is curan epithumian. One may therefore advance the hypothesis that Eros shares with desire a fundamental neutrality from an axiological point of view, so to speak, in the absence of further connotations. This seems to be confirmed on the one hand by many occurrences across the Xenophontic corpus, in which the objective genitive referring to Eros consists of a variety of objects, from war to water in Hellenica, from death to virtue in the Anabasis and on hunting. These instances have been usefully collected by Milena Lozano. This may also explain, on the other hand, the opposition between Eros directed towards the body and Eros directed towards the soul that informs Socrates' speech in chapter 8 of the Symposium, as well as the distinction between different types of love drawn in the first part of the speech. It is text 10 on handout. Namely, love for bodies, Eros ton somaton, opposed to what Thompson has called triple Eros. Love of the soul, Eros tes psyches, love of friendship, Eros tes philias, which is an interesting expression, and love of fine deeds, Eros ton kalon ergon. Tellingly, Callias is said to be in the grip of the latter sort of love, but I will return to this in a moment. Now, before moving on to other passages from the Symposium, it is worth noting that this reading can help explain both the figure of Socrates erotikos and the figure of Socrates as an expert in ta erotica, mentioned in the introduction. Indeed, it can be argued that it is precisely because Eros can be directed towards different objects and is morally determined by these objects that an episteme regarding Eros is required, a knowledge that Socrates possesses. This is what emerges from Memorabilia 26, 28, 31, corresponding to text 11, in which Socrates' expertise in love stands out. The general context is a conversation with Critobulus on how to gain friends of worth. At this point, Socrates reiterates that Critobulus should try to be good, agathos gignestai, and once achieved that, set about catching kallogagatoi. Socrates' following statement is noteworthy. I quote, "Perhaps I myself, as an expert in love, can lend you a hand in the pursuit of gentlemen." This utterance is reinforced at the end of the passage when Socrates goes so far as to attribute to himself an episteme on this subject by clarifying its nature to Critobulus, who wishes to learn how, I quote, "to win those with good souls as well as those with good bodies." No, Socrates replies, "it is not part of my skill and the heme episteme to lay hands on the handsome ones and force them to submit." So the specific object of this episteme is not explicitly defined, but several elements lead us to believe that it has to do primarily with the knowledge of the right objects to which one should direct Eros, and as a consequence with erotic behavior in a broader sense. One of the features of this correct erotic conduct seems to be reciprocity, to which Socrates gives particular emphasis in this Memorabilia passage. I quote again, "For when I want to catch anyone, it's surprising how I strain every nerve to have my love returned, my longing reciprocated by him, in my eagerness that wants me as much as I want him." On a textual level, it is noteworthy the reciprocity of desire expressed with antepithumeistai, in this case of synosia with each other, and the reciprocity of love, which, however, is expressed through with the word antiphile, the verb antiphilestai. Now, the use of philia-related terms is massive in the symposium, which also clarifies how this idea of reciprocity is closely connected to the acquisition of virtue. In the central paragraphs of his speech on Eros, where a series of arguments in favor of the love of the soul are expounded, Socrates introduces mutuality as one of the defining features of Eros tes psyches. After having shown to Callias the most prominent traits of the Uranus lover, Socrates states he wants now to prove, I quote, the reasonableness of the position that such a lover will have his affection returned, antiphilestai. In the following sections, he insists on this idea and conversely on the lack of mutuality in those relationships based on the love for the body. Now, more importantly, through the relationship between Callias and Autolycus, which is repeatedly praised by Xenophon, shows how the interaction between the lovers and the beloved's kalogagathia can produce a mutual stimulus to virtue. This emerges from the central section of the speech, particularly in paragraphs 26-27, which is reported as text 12. On the one hand, the beloved who recognizes that he cannot maintain his lover's philia without being a kalos kagathos will have concern for virtue, aretes epimeleistai. On the other hand, the lover has to practice virtue himself, as Cain areten, if he intends to make his favorite a philon agathon. So he has to keep himself self-controlled, that is to say, he has to be virtuous in turn. In short, in a relationship inspired by Eros tes psyches, a sort of virtuous circle is produced where the lover's aretē inspires that of the beloved and vice versa. It is interesting to know that, as mentioned in this section of Xenophon Symposium, Socrates actually argues in favor of philia. So while bound up with a specific kind of Eros, the Eros for the soul, this term is rarely used to define the object of Socrates' praise and is replaced from 815 onwards with the expression het tes psyches philia. While, however, one may conclude from this section of the symposium that in order to make Eros a stimulus to virtue, Socrates actually shifts to philia, the figure of Socrates erotikos reintroduces the Eros language and allows us to investigate the Eros aretē nexus from a different perspective. If the passages considered so far have depicted Socrates as an expert on Eros, so external to the erotic relationship, Xenophon alludes several times to Socrates being in love with beautiful souls. In Symposium 8.2, Socrates declares, I can't recall a time when I was not in love with someone. But a more relevant reference can be found in Memorabilia 4.1.2, which is text 13, where Xenophon reports Socrates' frequent claim to be in love with someone, tinos eran. His love being directed not towards the bodies of good-looking young men, as his lesson in the Symposium teaches, but towards, I quote, those whose souls are naturally inclined to virtue, pros aretēn. The following part of the passage, with the allusion to the benefits of education for such individuals, suggests that these souls Socrates was in love with are the same endowed souls that he sought out for education, so that Eros can be seen as a motivation behind Socrates' educational activity, and thus also in this sense as being at the source of that stimulus to virtue to which Socratic paideia is aimed. Such connection, however, is rather indirect. Nothing more specific can be said about the role of Socrates' Eros as a privileged means for transmitting virtue. The same holds true for the Eros for Socrates on the part of his companions, which Xenophon also hints at. In Symposium 8.4, which is text 13, Antisthenes declares he's in love with Socrates. The latter point, so Socrates as an object of Eros, has its fullest thematization in Plato, particularly in the Symposium, whereas the former point lies at the course Aeschines, Alcibiades will now turn to. In his discussion of the issue of whether or not boys' lovers should be allowed to associate with them, Plutarch includes Aeschines within, I quote, the whole band of men who sanctioned affection between men and thus guided the youth onward to learning, epitepaideia, leadership, and virtuous conduct, kaiten areten ton tropon. Plutarch's remark is most likely to be referred to the Alcibiades, which informs us about the nature of Socratic Eros, especially its role in the process of moral improvement through the Socrates-Alcibiades relationship. Key evidence in this regard comes from Aelius Aristides' De Rhetorica, which preserves the three most relevant fragments on the subject, reported as text 15 and 16 on the handout. Now, although they most likely belong to the final section of the dialogue, in order to get more directly to the Eros aretē nexus, it is useful to begin with them and read some other testimonies on the dialogue in the light of these concluding words. They are quite well known, but I'm going to summarize their content. So the first fragment draws an essential distinction between two ways in which one can be helpful, ophelesai, to others, opposing to techne an ability which is granted for divine dispensation, theia moira. Such an opposition is exemplified in the following fragment, 162, where the act of making other people better is compared to healing from sickness. Among the sick, some are treated by doctors and recover thanks to an anthropine techne, others heal theia moira, so thanks to a divine dispensation by which their desire, epithumia, directly leads them to what can improve their condition and cure them. In the third fragment, 174, the above trace distinction is explicitly referred to Alcibiades, and the ability to improve others is directly associated with Eros. The Eros that Socrates happened to be feeling etium canoneron for the young man put him in a condition similar to that of the Bacchants, who, filled with the god, can draw milk and honey from dry wells. This is why, despite lacking any art, techne, or science, mathema, to benefit other people, Socrates thought he could improve Alcibiades by associating with him and by making him better through love. Dia toeran. We'll go back to this expression in the conclusions. Now, leaving aside the problem of their actual order in the dialogue, these fragments make a crucial point in drawing a distinction between two ways of making other people better. So by imparting mathemata through a techne and by awakening thanks to a theia moira, an epithumia, to pursue virtue. The latter motive, as we have seen, is also attested in Xenophon's Socratic writings. Aeschines, however, explicitly states that the ability to engender such a desire for virtue is directly related to and actually dependent on Socrates' Eros. This crucial association, whose specific terms the dialogue leaves undetermined, can be better understood by looking at some accounts of the earlier conversation between Socrates and Alcibiades, to which the closing words of the dialogue most likely refer. The long speech on Themistocles delivered by Socrates and the presence of Alcibiades, again preserved by Aelius Aristides, deserves special attention as it may help interpret the first fragment and more generally the main issues surrounding the notion of aretē. The excerpts I am going to comment on are reported as text 17. The opening words of the speech, passage A, suggest that Alcibiades had gone so far as to criticize Themistocles and arguably to consider himself superior to the great politician. Alcibiades' conceit and overconfidence are also emphasized in another passage from the same oration, in which Aelius Aristides points to Alcibiades' phronema and arrogance. It was to undermine such convictions that the speech on Themistocles was designed. The following section represents long magic skills and outstanding valor, aiming at turning Alcibiades' attention to Themistocles' merits and to his valor on the battlefield. Before the decisive confrontation, both Themistocles and the king of Persia are aware that the conditions for victory do not lie in the size of armies or the superiority of military power, but in the good advice, bouleuestai, and above all in the aretē of their leaders. This emerges from passage B. This epainos is preparatory to the properly protected part of the speech. By extolling Themistocles' greatness, Socrates aimed to arouse Alcibiades' jealousy, as stated in a later passage from the same oration, prompting the young man to an impossible comparison with the politician. Indeed, after emphasizing the politician's superiority in intelligence, so to phronein and pragmata, and after reaching the peak of his praise, the moral exhortation implied in the speech becomes clear. The following section, which is text 17c, introduces a number of fundamental concepts, namely episteme, coupled with the previous reference to Themistocles' phronein, and epimeleia autou. A question then arises as to their relationship to the notion of aretē evoked above, and in the light of such relationship, that of the nature and object of virtue. The taking care of oneself seems to be presented here as a prerequisite for knowledge, as Socrates establishes a comparison between Themistocles' episteme and those who illusorily believe they can achieve something without epimeleia autou. Knowledge, in turn, takes the place of aretē from a certain point onwards in the discourse. It is this shift from one notion to another without further explanation that leads to the conclusion that the Aeschinian dialogue too goes in the direction of the identification between virtue and knowledge, attested by various other sources. As a consequence, epimeleia autou is also a prerequisite for virtue. This is what the Themistocles example ultimately aims to highlight. Later in the same oration, in text 18, Aelius Aristippus reports that Socrates had Alcibiades engage with Themistocles paraskeue, making him disheartened because he had not even nearly prepared himself like Themistocles. Now, the relationship between episteme and aretē established in the speech on Themistocles has further implications for the determination of the nature of virtue, and has led some scholars in particular to distinguish between an intellectual aretē and the moral aretē. This Dittmann first proposed this interpretation. This would explain the incompleteness of Themistocles' knowledge, who only possessed the former, and would clarify the content of Socrates' moral exhortation, which spurs Alcibiades to the latter. Despite these interpretive strands, however, there does not seem to be sufficient textual evidence to establish with certainty a clear distinction between two types of virtue. The ultimate object of this aretē knowledge fostered by Socrates seems to be left undetermined, at least in the portion of the dialogue available to us. What the speech on Themistocles suggests is that there is a graduation of aretē, or rather a graduation in the possession of aretē. This could also explain why Themistocles' knowledge turns out to be insufficient, an aspect that is emphasized by Aelius Aristippus more than once. The line of argument could be as follows. So Socrates first extols Themistocles' aretē so as to emphasize the difficulty of reaching even this first stage of his ideal of virtue. To this end, he outlines a sort of ladder. So Xerxes, Spudaios, and aretē was surpassed by Themistocles, who was nevertheless still far from the highest degree of that aretē that enabled him to prevail over the Persian king. In this way, Socrates may have shown Alcibiades the height at which the required ideal of virtue stood, and thus induced the young man, who was also far from the model of virtue embodied by Themistocles, to acknowledge his own inadequacy. So Themistocles' failure raises at least two further issues. The first one is the problem of the teachability of virtue, which I cannot delve into here. Suffices to say that one may argue with Barbara Ehlers that Themistocles' exile represented his failure in the moral education of his fellow citizens. The main point of comparison will evidently be, in this case, Plato's Gorgias, in which Themistocles' exiles is also mentioned, and in which the proof that the four leading politicians of Athens did not possess aretē is precisely the fact that they had not made their fellow citizens better. The second question is more relevant to our topic and concerns a possible allusion to the limits of techne, assuming that Themistocles' knowledge was ultimately of this sort. Indeed, in this case, we could draw a connection with the first of the three fragments, dealing with precisely with the limits of techne, or at least the non-necessity of techne as a tool for improving others. But Socrates does claim to have made Alcibiades better and traces this beneficial action back to the extraordinary effect of his Eros, based in turn on a divine dispensation. A first question is therefore what this improvement consists of. To answer this question, it is worth dwelling a little more on Alcibiades' original condition. We have mentioned his phronema, but Maximus of Tyre provides us with a further element. The passage quoted as text 19 suggests that Alcibiades' pride was probably presented as a state of illness. I quote, Alcibiades sickens, nausea Alcibiades, a hot fierce fire devours him, confuses his mind, and so on. Now, this passage likely belonged to the opening section of the dialogue and may be connected to the second fragment preserved by Aelius Aristides. Let us recall that Socrates' statement about Theia Moira in fragment 1 is further explained through a comparison with medicine. So by combining Maximus of Tyre's passage with the opposition between two ways of healing from sickness, we can conclude that the sick Alcibiades could not be cured through anthropine techne, which again shows its limits, but only through Theia Moira, which puts Socrates in the condition to heal him out of metaphor to make him better. What are we to understand that by that Beltion poiesae, which in all likelihood represented the last word of the dialogue? An answer can be found in Alcibiades' reaction to Socratic elenchus. We have already seen an early stage of this reaction described by Aelius Aristides, but a fundamental piece of information is provided by Cicero, who explicitly refers to virtue, text 12. In this passage from Tuscan Disputations, Cicero vividly describes the process by which Socrates leads Alcibiades to acknowledge his own amathia and the consequent need for aretē. According to this account, Socrates makes Alcibiades realize that in spite of his noble birth, he did not differ from a Iulus. So as a consequence of this awareness, the young man begs Socrates to free him from turpitudo and to teach him virtus in Cicero's text. Now, as suggested by Ehlers, Alcibiades' collapse, so to say, probably marked the end of the conversation between Socrates and Alcibiades, followed by the concluded words preserved by Aelius Aristides, in which Socrates recounts the previous conversation. Indeed, the concluding words seem to fit well with Socrates' account of the effects of his elenchus. Alcibiades had not even cared to investigate the conditions that would have made his political goals possible, and now he realizes he's far from the necessary preparation for politics, and even farther from that higher degree of aretē episteme that would have saved Themistocles from exile and failure. More importantly, he is set on the path to virtue, as his plea to Socrates shows. Now, if we recall again that for those who heal by a divine person, as stated in the second fragment, I quote again, desire, epithumia, leads to what will profit them. We shall conclude that through a series of elenchoi that have come down to us only to a very small extent, Socrates instilled in Alcibiades a desire to acquire virtue, which brings him remarkably close to Xenophon's Socrates. Now, how does Alcibiades' desire for aretē specifically interact with Socrates' Eros? Does it depend on Socrates' Eros? The testimonies at our disposal do not allow us to provide conclusive answers, but only to advance hypotheses. Some clues can be gained from a passage by Plutarch corresponding to text 21. Similarly to Xenophon's Memorabilia, we find here the idea that Alcibiades' improvement is due to a sort of response to Socratic virtue, which is at the same time a paradigm for the young man and the source of his feeling of inadequacy. Noteworthy is also the allusion to the image of love, eidolon erotos, that Alcibiades is said to possess, and which is compared by Plutarch to the notion of anteros in Plato's Phaedrus. And in light of this, we may read the third fragment reported by Erōs Aristippus. Socrates has neither techne to teach nor mathemata to impart. It is only because he is filled with Eros that he is able to make Alcibiades better, that is, to make him desire virtue. One point to emphasize is that the fact of being possessed by Eros, like a bacchant or like the poets of Plato's Aeon, is not at odds with Socrates' elenctic activity, nor with the underlying appeal to episteme. With its last turn, the speech on Themistocles acquires a distinctly elenctic character. Therefore, Socrates recurs to Eros as to be somehow integrated into elenchos. How this interaction actually took place in the concrete development of the dialogue is a matter of conjecture. The same goes for some questions related to the Eros-aretē relationship, such as, is Socrates only able to make other people better when he is feeling with love, so that he is only able to improve those he is in love with? Furthermore, can the role of Socratic Eros as a means of both leading to aretē and achieving aretē be abstracted from the individual relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades? So, in other words, can it be generalized and above all reproduced? The Aspasia and some evidence from the Aspasia helps us answering these questions. First of all, in the Aspasia 2, Aeschines shows the educational power of Eros at the interpersonal level, so to speak, of individual relationships. I have given in the handout only two testimonies by way of example, both its text 22 and 23, both reporting that Aspasia not only made Pericles into an effective political orator, but succeeded in the same task with the ship merchant Lycicles. Both cases are meant to exemplify to different degrees Aspasia's educational skills in this sphere, and in both cases, Eros is involved. A different relationship between Eros and aretē is portrayed with a well-known episode of Xenophon and his wife, preserved in Latin translation by Cicero, text 24. In short, Aspasia's questions to Xenophon and his wife aim to convey the idea that the search for a better husband or wife is vain unless both partners aim to be Aristoi. Unlike Socrates in the Alcibiades, and unlike herself with Pericles and Lycicles, in this case, Aspasia is not personally involved in the erotic relationship. Therefore, she engenders a desire for self-improvement by appealing to the Eros which others have for one another. The Socratic questioning, which leads both Xenophon and his wife to aporia, is here aimed at getting the couple acknowledge their desire for the best possible partner. The next step is to show that the desire of each of them can only be satisfied by the other. So only if both strive for moral improvement and care for aretē can they have their own desires satisfied. Aspasia therefore shows the two spouses how to improve themselves. She knows the best way to virtue and can lead them to it. This also occurs thanks to her dialectical skills and against the backdrop of the general conversation in which Socrates refutes Callias. Therefore, as in the Alcibiades, the starting point is Socratic elenchus, but in the Aspasia, the conversation is immediately turned to Eros, since the introduction of the figures of Tergilia and Rhododeon. Moreover, Aspasia is aware of the key role of Eros in fostering moral improvement and resorts to it for this purpose. More explicitly than in the case of Socrates in the Alcibiades, her ability to improve others stems from a combination of the two, so the use of elenchus and the understanding of the nature of Eros. In doing so, she ultimately displays the same expertise that Xenophon Socrates ascribes to himself. This last point paves the way for some parallels to Plato, which can be drawn before concluding. Plato's Socrates, too, famously claims to be an expert in Tairotica. In a well-known passage from the Symposium, which is text 25, Socrates declares he knows, I quote, about anything except erotic things. Now, I would like to suggest that this claim only finds its full explanation in the final praise of Alcibiades and not entirely in the speech of Socrates Diotima. Tellingly, it is in Alcibiades' Logos that we find the other two aspects mentioned in the introduction, so the figure of Socrates Erastes and Socrates as an object of Eros. As far as the former is concerned, Socrates himself expressly refers to his love for Alcibiades in 13c7, it's text 26 on the handout, and immediately after declares he has fallen in love with him. Afututo Erasten. Now, the figure of Socrates Erastes is well attested in the Platonic corpus. This is how Socrates defines himself at the beginning of the first Alcibiades, a further references in the Gorgias, and one may think more generally of the opening scenes of the Charmides and the Protagoras. This symposium, however, allows us to investigate more specifically the connection between Socrates' Eros and the attempt to improve Alcibiades. The fact that Socrates presents himself as a lover leads Alcibiades to conceive their relationships in terms of mixed favors, according to the pattern outlined by Pausanias. This emerges from another famous passage, which is text 27, in which Alcibiades is reporting on his attempts to seduce Socrates. And in declaring his intentions to Socrates, he states, "You seem to me to be the only worthy lover I've had. Emuerastes axios monos." And shortly afterwards, he says, "For me, there's nothing more important than becoming as good person as possible. Beltion genestai, and in this, I don't think there's any more effective collaborator than you." If you look at the table I have inserted after the passage, you can see that the similarities with Pausanias' speech are quite clear. Indeed, Pausania had presented the virtuous case of someone who wishes to be, I quote, wishes to be of service to someone because he thinks that through him, he will be a better person. And in his account, the rule, the nomos for the beloved consisted in rendering any service whatever to the person who is making him wise and good. So in short, they share the idea that according one's favors to a lover is not shameful if the eromenos acts for the sake of wisdom and virtue, that is, in the belief that his lover will make him better. Now, the fact that Alcibiades adopts or follows this pattern shows his misunderstanding of the real nature of Socratic Eros, and leads him to interpret Socrates' refusal as hubristes. Such misunderstanding is revealed by Alcibiades' complaint about the fact that Socrates presents himself as an Erastes, and then he proves to be the Eromenos. This is the core of the last passage of the Symposium reported on the handout, text 28, in which the role of Socrates as object of Eros, also found in Xenophon's Symposium, is placed in the foreground. Alcibiades applies the image of the Silenus already employed to describe Socrates to Socrates' logoi, which are amusing and laughable on the outside, but once opened, turn out to be, I quote, to the highest degree divine, contain within them the greatest number of status of virtue, agalmata aretes. Once disclosed, these logoi about virtue and Socrates with them become the object of Alcibiades and others, Eros. From a Platonic perspective, what Alcibiades does not understand is that feeling Eros is a necessary step for the ascent toward beauty itself. But as far as Socratic erotics is concerned, he does not understand the role of Eros as a driving force for acquiring the virtue and knowledge he is seeking. In this regard, some scholars have rightly pointed out that the ultimate aim of Socratic love in the symposium is to engender in the beloved the desire that belongs to lovers. And one may read, in light of this, Socrates' earlier statement to be an expert in tairotica. Now, I'm going to conclude. If this specific dynamic, about which much more could be said, is characteristic of Plato's Socrates, the underlying role of Eros is common to other accounts. In Xenophon, Eros ultimately represents a strong desire that, just like epithumia, is defined by its object. If properly directed, it can pave the way to kalogagatia and thus to virtue. Its role in Socrates' dialogical practice is not explicit. The only hint is Socrates' own Eros for those souls that are inclined to virtue and that he chooses to educate. In Aeschines, Socrates' Eros is expressly presented as the only means at his disposal, as opposed to techne, to improve others, and in particular Alcibiades. A close reading of the Aspasia shows, however, that the diaton eran mentioned in the concluding words of the dialogue is not necessary to be referred to Socrates' own Eros. If it is true that in Aeschines, to use Kant's word, moral improvement is always self-improvement, Eros is that impulse for moral and intellectual improvement that Socrates arouses in Alcibiades, and not only the Eros that Socrates feels for the young man, which is nonetheless necessary for the philosopher to acquire the capacity to improve others. We might conclude that as an impulse to acquire virtue, which in Aeschines too is indissociable from episteme, the Eros aroused in others as a priority. So it's more important in ethical and epistemic terms, a priority over Eros experienced as a lover. This is also true for, being an object of Eros as a beloved. This is also true of Plato, whereby Socrates arouses in those who are in love with him through his erotic behavior, the epithumia that is proper to lovers. Unlike Aeschines, however, this Socratic Eros cannot be reproduced by others. Socrates' expertise in tairotica turns out to be inextricably bound up with his role as Erastes and then as object of Eros. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for getting late.
So now that I'm unmuted, I'll clap on behalf of the group, and we'll have a discussion moderated by me. The method is to please raise your hand using the raise your hand function. If you have difficulty with that, you can send me a chat or put something in the chat or send some message to Socrates Society email address, which I will monitor. So I invite questions and comments. Milena.
Hi. Well, I have a lot of questions, but you can answer what you want. First, maybe more a comment on the one of the first things you said, that the value of Eros and epithemia depends on the object for Xenophon. And I think Xenophon is so flexible with values in a way that even the object, the same object, can be good or bad. Like, it doesn't depend only on the object, but also on how we manage towards that object, I think, right? Like ambition, for example, or I don't remember the example you gave, I think was ambition or something similar to that. Could be a good thing for Xenophon or not. And the other thing I was wondering is if you think this kind of Eros you were telling us about is not the philosophical Eros, is not sexual at all. In Xenophon, for example, it's just a strong desire that has no relation with the what we will call erotic feelings, or is some relation there? Like, I don't know, maybe in Plato we can say, because of the erotic ladder, that there is the same impulse like developed, but I'm not sure if in Xenophon is like that or not.
Yes, thanks, Milena, for the questions. And thanks for your remark about the first point. It is true that, I mean, it is always difficult to find fixed categories when it comes to Xenophon, and when you shift also from one genre to another, from Socratic works to historical writings, for example, the pattern and the general judgment sometimes change correspondingly. But I would say that maybe I mean, on the negative side, you have more flexibility, but the point I was trying to make, that the epithumia as aretē is something positive. So in that case, epithumia itself is not something that pushes away from virtue, but actually can have virtue as its object. Is not, I think there's no room for a shift in judgment about that. I would say that it's positive in itself, but it is true that the negative pole of the question is much more nuanced, and one really needs to look context by context. And as far as the second question raises enormous issues. I would say a very general point, that it is far from clear that the philosophical error depicted by Plato, but also in Xenophon Socratic writings, has some connection or reflect the Athenian practice. So the ethos as such. Of course, this is very clear in Antisthenes, for example, when the stress on the theory of the sophos actually determines the judgment and the evaluation about Eros. This is the general premise, that we have to presuppose a hiatus between the two aspects. But I would say that the philosophical Eros is broader than specifically. It's not necessarily in contradiction too, but it's broader than epithumia, and so it's also broader of the physical desire in itself. It's a kind of, my impression is that in Xenophon you have this umbrella concept, which is epithumia, and then Eros is a strong form of epithumia, and as such I think it cannot be it cannot be reduced to I mean, physical attraction of Eros, which has with aphrodisia. So otherwise, such insistence of the distinction.
Okay. Emilio Spinelli.
Yes, many thanks, dear Francesca, for your very rich talk and also for many important things you underline. So I have only one real question and two minor questions about translation. So the question is about the role and the features of epithumia in Xenophon. So you just underline the fact that maybe it is an umbrella term. Okay, this is true, but it is true that we should pay attention each time to the adjectives that we find linked to epithumia. Because in text 7, for example, we have a clear example of ponera epithumia, but in text 9, we have a good example of ischura epithumia. So in this case, this is the question. What does it mean? And which is the meaning you give to ischura? It is linked to ischius in which sense? Which kind of ischius is here at issue? A sort of another variations on theme as enkrateia, or something stronger, namely a form of ischius that is linked to the philosophical effort and namely to knowledge once again. It is a sort of intellectualistic form of ischura epithumia or something different? This is the question. Two minor points of translation, text number 11, where we find the translation of episteme with skill, and I fully disagree. So in this case, maybe it is worth stressing the fact that we have a strong form of episteme in the more strict epistemological sense, namely knowledge and not ability and not expertise. It is knowledge. Otherwise, it is difficult to find this kind of term attributed to Socrates. And text 14, where really I do not understand the translation of sphodra. So medley. Why medley? So medley, it's something that we can attribute maybe to Alcibiades, but surely not to Antisthenes. Okay, and so maybe it's simply especially, or something like that, very, very basic translation of sphodra. And the fact that you can link madness to Alcibiades is demonstrated by text number 19, and also from many other texts. So I really do not understand the translation there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Emilio. I'm starting so thanks for these questions. All of them are really useful. Yeah, it is, the point was exactly that epithumia needs to be qualified each time, and the adjective it is associated with shows exactly that he needs to be further qualified, that connotated in one sense or the other. And so in the case of ponera, it's clear the allusion to ischius is worth to be further explored, actually, because there is, for example, it comes to my mind, there is this the testimony by Diogenes Laertius about the writings of Aeschines. He says that he wrote 7 dialogues who show the Socratic ischius. So I would not exclude that in this case an intellectualistic stance is at play. Given, I mean, the general context also of the work, but it is something I really need to explore further, so thanks. And as for the translation, yeah, I absolutely agree. I drawn the translations from the in the case of, this is both from Xenophon Symposium, from the Loeb edition without modifying them, but it is true that skill is a completely inadequate translation for episteme, which is a much stronger sense, and also to demonstrate the connection to the speech on Themistocles in Aeschines and Alcibiades. It is useful to stress that it is episteme, because this is actually the same term that occurs there. And also about spodra, yes. I think when including the translation on in the book, I will definitely pay attention to these slippery terms and to modify where necessary the Loeb translation, which in the two cases you point out is not so precise. Thanks.
Okay, next, Carolina Araujo.
Thank you, Francesca. That was very interesting. I have two related questions. The first one is, do you agree that Eros means some kind of vertical relation in which one of the partners lacks and one doesn't lack? And so there is a kind of unbalance between the partners. So this is a previous question. And then if you agree with this premise, I would like you to help me with the Aspasia passage, because it's not very clear for me that this is a problem of Eros here. Eros, as I understand, is not mentioned. And you suggested some kind of reciprocity that is involved. And I don't see exactly the passage mentioning something like one to have Eros for each other. I think the passage suggests how both must desire the good in a certain way, but not this kind of interrelation Eros. I don't see there. So these are the two questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carolina. As for the first question, this is a huge issue. This is, behind this view of Eros as a vertical relation and asymmetrical relation, there is, of course, the Foucaultian interpretation, which has stressed a lot this isomorphism between the erotic roles and the social roles in the traditional pederastic relationship. I would, as you know, this has been radically criticized by feminist thinkers. So in the 90s, there was this war of interpretation between Foucaultian, the Foucaultian interpretation and the feminist interpretation. But I would say that in the case of Socratic Eros, we really, the key is maybe to shift from this dynamics of roles understood in the traditional sense and the real aim of Socratic Eros. So I'm persuaded that the fact that the erotic roles are also reshaped in terms of fixity and hierarchy, it's only a consequence of the new role ascribed to Eros, basically also on an epistemic level, especially in Plato, and more generally in a moral sense, but at the level of a moral theory. And then the verticality or asymmetry of the relationship itself is only a byproduct of this major change. And so when we shift the focus, most of these questions which have animated the debate for decades maybe can be downplayed a little bit or smoothed. Thanks. And as for the Aspasia, it is true that in that case it is So basically, the Xenophon passage needs to be read in the economy of the dialogue. So especially, I'm referring especially to Aspasia's comparison with the Hetaira, Thargelia, and Rhodogeon's, where the issue of Eros as such, you really have the Eros terminology, in that case is brought at the center of the discussion. And then it is a matter of conjecture and of interpretation to read also the Aspasia passage preserved by Cicero in light of this overarching discussion about Eros and about the positive effects of Eros on a political level with Lysicles and Pericles, and on a moral level with Xenophon, Xenophon and his wife episodes. But it is true that all the interpreters who stress the role of Eros and also the reciprocity of Eros read the Aspasia in the light of the other fragments and testimonies on the dialogue. Otherwise, it is true that taken itself, the terminology is not explicit, and the reciprocity here is not intended as Eros for each other, but the impulse to improve oneself for the other is some way symmetrical. So each has to, I mean, it is not one directional, but it has to be both ways in order to have this desire for a better partner realized. It is true that it's not reciprocity itself intended as reciprocity of affection or Eros, which is not there. Thanks.
Okay, André Lanoux.
Yes, hello. Ciao, Francesca. So thank you for your beautiful presentation, first and foremost. And so my question is slightly off topic, perhaps, but there's a few passages that came to mind while listening to you. First, in the Les Mémorables of Xenophon, what we have is at some point in the more apologetic part of the Mémorables, what we have Socrates that explains, he explains that Socrates refused to transmit his knowledge to Critias and Alcibiades as long as he didn't prove themselves virtuous. In the Symposium of Plato, then we have the same thing more or less, whereas Alcibiades tells the tale of Socrates' virtue, which is manifested in many different ways. He also explains how he wanted to hear all of his knowledge. And Socrates refused to transmit everything. Yet, and this is the puzzling part for me, and I would like to have your opinion on that. Also, Socrates says to Agathon at the beginning of the dialogue that he criticizes him for presenting his knowledge in front of 30,000 Greeks. He also mentions that knowledge is not like a liquid that you can, what's the word in English? Pour from one recipient to the other. And in the Republic, what we have talking about virtue and the necessary qualities for people to be selected as potential philosophers or higher levels of the Republic in around 485, 88, and then 535, 37, if I remember properly, but I don't have the text in front of me. Also there, you can see that virtue is a necessity for later acquisition of knowledge, not only cognitive abilities. So now, since we have this continuity in both Xenophon and Plato, in my opinion, how would you interpret that? There's been an interpretation that everybody knows in Italy, which is the Scuola di Tubinga Milano, where there's a difference between knowledge that you transmit through the written form and through the oral form. Would you see that there is in those passages something to go for that reading, or would you more have an adult type of approach to it? Knowledge has to be followed by a very long process of exercice spirituel, and this is why it cannot be transmitted this way. how would you basically put those passages together? And especially the puzzle of Alcibiades saying that actually he says to have seen the interiority of Socrates with the statues of virtue and he says that he claims to have seen it. So how do we deal with those passages? How would you put them together? That's my question, basically. Yeah, I hope it's not too much of a puzzling one, and I hope I was clear.
Thanks, Andre. That was there is a lot of material and a lot of questions within the question. I will try to, just to mix. I'm not sure I got all the points. I'm just maybe pointing out some. Yes, I was just making some point. As the memorabilia passage you quoted in that case, I think the fact that Critias and Alcibiades they lost their virtue once they turn away from Socrates. In that case, I think you don't. Yeah, it is interesting to draw parallels with Plato, but I think we do not understand that passage if we don't bear in mind that different from Antisthenes, for example, in Xenophon, aretē is something that can be lost. So if the exercise, if the ascesis is not going on, so Antisthenes defines aretē and against the backdrop of this theory of the Esophos as a weapon, as an arm that cannot be lost. And but in Xenophon, Socratic writing is not like this. So in that case, it is really the relationship between aretē and ascesis and the exercise for virtue that explains why, of course, Xenophon turns this point to apologetic purposes and shows that Alcibiades and Critias lost once they stopped associating with Socrates, stopped also exercising then virtue, and so have lost it. It is an apologetic term, but there is this this notion at the this underlying assumption that I think it is not something that can be easily compared to Plato or to Antisthenes, for example. And as far and as regards the agathon scenes, it is true that there is a tension when it comes to the transmission of virtue or the transmission of knowledge and in Socratic education, especially if you extend the analysis to other passages, the Theages, the Aeschines, you see that actually Socratic paideia is something fragile. I mean, when you look at other sources than in Plato, with fragile I mean that the Socrates as an educator is not in control of the outcomes of his educational activity in many cases. Sometimes it depends from Theia Moira, sometimes it depends from the daimonion, like also in the Theaetetus, which decide which kind of pupils go on and which one not. But in the case of this scene of the symposium, I think the point is that the knowledge is not something that can be transmitted by physical proximity. And so you have in this case a tension between synousia, which is a term which is repeatedly used in the context of Socratic education, but synousia, so this association with Socrates, shall not be confused with a physical transmission from the fuller to the emptier in a mechanical way, because it is related to the thing we have been saying. So if a desire for self-improvement and a desire for virtue is needed to set on the path for virtue, then it rules out a mechanical or vertical or so to say traditional transmission of virtue in terms of imparting doctrines without an effort and without an involvement, an active involvement on the part of the learner.
Okay,
I don't know.
maybe we can have a concise question from Alessandro Stavru, and
it will be very concise. So first of all, thank you, Francesca, for this wonderful talk. It was very enlightening as always. My question is about those Aeschines passages, which I was working on recently, and in particular the Themistocles passages, because I don't agree with Applegate and others who think that episteme in Themistocles is connected to epimeleia heautou. I think that Themistocles has episteme and does not have epimeleia heautou. This is how I read the passage. Whereas Socrates has epimeleia heautou, or at least he wants Alcibiades to care about himself without having any knowledge. So I see a counterposition, very strong counterposition between Socrates, who has no knowledge, who has no Sophia, and Themistocles, who has episteme. And because Themistocles has episteme and no epimeleia heautou, he will end up being in exile and not able to come back to Athens, even if he has all that huge military and political knowledge. So I tend to see those two things, episteme and epimeleia heautou, as two counterposed things which have no connection with each other. So either you have episteme, and in that case you don't care about yourself as Themistocles, or you have no episteme, no Sophia whatsoever as Socrates, and in that case you improve yourself, because you can improve only if you have no proper episteme, if you always tend toward something which you don't have, which is in this case knowledge and episteme and everything. So in that case, I think there are some issues about this interpretation. I see that, Field, Applegate, and many have different ways of viewing this connection, but I tended to see it this way. So this was just my viewpoint on that.
Yeah, thanks, Alessandro. I will be very brief too. It is a possible reading. What make me reluctant to oppose in these terms episteme and epimeleia heautou is the text that reported as 17c. So it seems to me that here Socrates' argument goes as follows. So he contrasts those. So Themistocles, the insufficiency of Themistocles' episteme, so the fact that Themistocles failed in spite of such a great episteme, he says episteme tos aute, and those who pretend to achieve any kind of result without epimeleia heautou. It is not clear how they interact one with the other, but it seems to me that they are not contrasted, because epimeleia, so it is not an opposition. It is an invitation to see how episteme itself is not a guarantee for success in the case of Themistocles, and then this is compared with those that not even care about themselves, which is Alcibiades, something that I would say Themistocles has done. I'm not sure. It was my way to reading this specific passage, but thanks for your point of view, and I'm going to think further about.
Okay,
this.
I think we have time for one last question and answer if people are concise. Noburo.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Francesca. I have a very quick question. You discussed a general theory of Eros, but I think Eros is a very particular personal love with someone. And I'm asking about the missing of Alcibiades in Xenophon. What do you think about it? Because Xenophon didn't use Alcibiades as the example of love. You know, he used in the book 1, chapter 2, but it's nothing to do with love. Instead, he used Euthydemus. So I think it matters, I think, how to interpret Eros, because Plato and Aeschines share the same Alcibiades, maybe intertextuality, but Xenophon refused it. What do you think about it?
That's absolutely true. Thanks a lot. This is true, and also this has been pointed out. Also, already Gian Antoni pointed out that this shift from Alcibiades to Euthydemus, in his view, has apologetic purposes. Yeah, in the way, I think. In this case, the real opposition is not only in the way they conceive Eros, but in the way they choose to portray the Socrates-Alcibiades relationship. So they pursue different apologetic strategies, so to say. Plato, Xenophon, some reason chooses to be more radical about that, and so he's the only author in which, so if we think also Antisthenes also depicts writes a dialogue entitled Alcibiades. So Xenophon is the only author in which the Socrates-Alcibiades relationship is not depicted as an erotic one. I think it cannot be separated from an apologetic agenda, but maybe in that case we must take in consideration, besides the different conception of Eros, despite the similarities, also the different strategies for political concerns and apologetic purposes, the different strategies they pursue when it comes to defend Socrates from having corrupting the youth, and Alcibiades being the exemplary figure for that. But thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming today. The next, hope to see you at our next talk on October 12th. Put it on your calendars, October 12th. And let's applaud our speaker. And thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.